Ohayou gozaimasu. Good morning. Welcome to video number 4, World History, World War I Causes and Conditions. This is Mr. Levy, and I'm very excited to have you here. So, in our last assignment, which hopefully you've completed, we started talking about World War I. Just as a quick review, what was World War I? It was a global war that originated in Europe. It started in Europe. It lasted from 1914 to 1918, um, but it ended up impacting the entire world. So we have a map here of Europe, and the majority of the fighting was done here in Western Europe and here in Eastern Europe. But as we said, it did actually impact Africa, Asia, and even the United States, North America in different ways. So that's why it's really referred to as the First World War. Important to remember, it's happening from around 1914 to 1918. All right. So, as I mentioned in your earlier assignment, when you watched the documentary, you probably got a sense of who was involved in the war, what the conditions were, what the fighting actually looked like. So, what we're going to talk about in this video are kind of what the causes of the war were and what the outcomes were. So, in what is kind of an oversimplification of the situation, um, a lot of times we'll refer to um, four primary causes of the war. And we give them a nice acronym MAIN, because that makes it easy to remember. And so the first cause would be militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly talk about each four of these things and how they relate to the start of World War One, hopefully to make bring some of these ideas together for us. I'm not going to go in this order, starting with M, because it makes a little more sense to do it differently. But I'll come back around and we're going to hold on to this easy acronym of MAIN to be able to refer to it down the road. So, for the past few weeks, we've been talking about imperialism in this class. So, as you remember, imperialism is this process where industrialized countries, seek to really dominate other countries both politically and economically. And they do this for a number of reasons, but one of the primary ones was the need for more raw materials to fuel the engines of industrialization, the factories making new things, and also to create new markets where they can sell these new things. Um, and obviously, as this imperialism occurred between this industrial countries, it caused a lot of tension and competition. So we have a painting over here on the right side, which shows China upset and angry as you have five imperialist countries, empires represented by England, Germany, Russia, France, and Japan, carving up China in their competition to grow their empires. So that's a nice visual representation of kind of what was happening during this time. These different empires kind of carving up the rest of the world. So another cause of World War One was nationalism. So what is nationalism? Nationalism is essentially a celebration of a country or a nation's interests, and the idea that the country is more important than anything else. So Germany is the most important thing for Germans. The country of Germany is successful and thrives. And what makes Germany maybe is its shared heritage, language, and culture. And the people within Germany that share that heritage, language, and culture, they're German, so they must support this country, this nation. Maybe people that are ethnically different or speak a different language, maybe they're seen as secondary citizens within this idea of unified national interest. But basically it's this idea that this country is the most important thing and it must go forward. And this is, can happen anywhere. So this is the case at this time in Great Britain, in France, in Japan, in Russia, in any of these imperialist nations. They were saying, our national interests are more important than anything else. And this was true when it came to foreign affairs, because the interests of Great Britain are more important than anything else. Our Navy needs to go where it needs to go to make sure Great Britain is strong. And if you want to get in the way, you do it at your own risk. We will use, our Navy to ensure that Great Britain stays strong. So, for example, some of these ideas where nationalism was occurring were, Germany was growing, and Germany and Austria share a language together, and that's German. And they share a heritage to a certain degree. So Germany and Austria started, identifying as having shared national interests. Nationalism was occurring in Russia, and in Russia, a lot of Russians I would identify as Slavic, an ethnic group. And because they were Slavic and there were other Slavs in other parts of Eastern Europe, Russians began saying, like, we are champions of Slavic people wherever they may be. So these are different ideas of what nationalism can look like. And it gets really linked up with patriotism. So over here on the right, we see a recruiting poster when the war starts in England, in Great Britain, where the lion kind of represented the country, and it's calling young British people to support the country because that's what's most important. So this is an idea of nationalism that was going on at this time. We also had a lot of militarism going on. So militarism is essentially an emphasis on growing a strong military. And this was happening in all these industrialized countries. So they have the factories and the technology to build their military. They also have an interest in being the strongest so they can grow their empire, and they don't want to be weaker than any of their neighbors. So Germany starts really growing their army, and they eventually become the strongest in Europe because they don't want to become weaker than France. Um, Britain, they start growing their navy because England has had a strong navy for many years, and they don't want to be weaker than England. So all these nations start really growing their military, pumping a lot of money and effort into science and technology. And what this results in is many types of new weapons that we'll talk about: tanks, planes, guns, and ships that are more effective at killing humans than anything we've ever seen before. And of course, they're glorifying the military, as we see here. It was soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. They're held up as heroes in the nation, that they are doing a noble thing by being in the military, and they're held up as examples for other people within the country. So those are elements of militarism that are going on throughout all these imperial countries. Oh, and the last thing, that I don't have a bullet to mention, and the military has a very strong influence in the governments of all these empires. So before we go on to alliances, the last of the four causes, if you will, of World War I, I'm going to talk about the spark that officially sets off the wars. So you have militarism, you have nationalism, you have imperialism, all going on for quite a while before World War I starts. And then the thing that officially sets it off is in June 28th of 1914, the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand, is traveling through one of that empire's um, countries or areas that they control. It's called the Balkans, and this is in southern Europe. The Austrian Empire has exerted their influence and made the Balkans part of their empire. And not everyone there is happy about this. In fact, a lot of the ethnic groups, Serbians, Croatians, Bosnians, they are not thrilled about being part of this empire. And on June 28th, 1914, when the head of that empire, Archduke Ferdinand, is riding with his wife in a convertible car through the capital of Sarajevo, a young man named Gavrilo Princip, who was a Serbian nationalist, shoots both the Archduke and his wife. Princip is doing this because he believes that the Serbians, who are Slavs, deserve their own independent state. He wants them to be free of this empire. And that is what motivates him to kill Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So, this is an example of how nationalism, the desire for an own independent state, motivated this young man to do this, to assassinate this leader. Nationalism and imperialism is also part of why Austro-Hungary had exerted its authority to dominate this part of Europe in the first place. They had gone south of their traditional borders in Austria and Hungary, and south into the Balkans to exert their control. They thought this was best for Austria, um, and so that's what justified it. So this is the thing, the spark that officially ignites the world and starts the war. The powder that creates the condition for it are those other causes of militarism, imperialism, and nationalism. And the last thing we're going to talk about, which is alliances. So for many decades before the assassination of Franz Duke Ferdinand in 1914, the different imperial countries had been making these alliances to support each other. So basically, it's the simple idea that, hey, we're going to agree that we're on the same team. And if anyone attacks you, I've got your back. And if anyone attacks me, you've got my back. And this will make us stronger together if any of our enemies try and mess with us. So before 1914, two major alliances occurred or were in place. One was the Triple Alliance, and this was Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Italy were basically saying, yeah, I've got your back. On the other hand, there was this group called the Triple Entente, and this was an alliance between France, Russia, and Great Britain. And these are the two primary sides in World War I when it starts. The Central Powers, which are the Triple Alliance to start, joined later by the Ottoman Turks, the Ottoman Empire, who we know about, and the Triple Entente, who later becomes known as the Allies, that get joined by the United States, among others. So these are the two sides fighting the war. And these alliances play out in this way, kind of illustrated nicely by this cartoon, in almost a domino effect. So here you have Princip assassinating the Archduke, somewhat, attacking the Austro-Hungarian Empire here. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to come down and punish Princip and the Serbian nationalists that he was a part of. Now, as I mentioned, the Serbs are Slavs, and Russia here is the champion of the Slavs. So they're going to tell the Austro-Hungarians, hey, you don't want to do that, because if you punish these guys, I'm going to punish you. Now, of course, Germany is an ally of Austria-Hungary, and they come out and say, hey, you go after Austria-Hungary, you have a problem with us. Now, of course, England and France are here, allies with Russia. So once that happens, they have to get involved. And you have this domino effect that sets off the explosion that will be World War I. All these allies are committed to defending each other, so they all, get their armies ready and go to war. And that is the lead up the causes that kind of pushed the world to this war very quickly. It's a very quick and dirty summary, um, but that's the time we've got. So militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, main. Those are the four primary causes of World War One for our purposes. Um, so really quickly, the conditions that the war itself were fought in were horrible. Again, if you watch the documentary, if you've seen a movie like 1917 or read a book like All Quiet on the Western Front, you know that the conditions that these men fought in were horrific. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about it. Suffice to say that you had all this new technology meant to kill, and this included things like poison gas, machine guns, tanks. It was all being fought in trenches and trench warfare, heck, airplanes. All this new technology was made to kill people, and the problem was the generals and the soldiers were still fighting the war as if that new technology didn't exist. So they were still fighting it by basically marching in straight lines, trying to take territory away from each other, forgetting like that these new technologies made marching in a straight formation in a straight line against machine guns not very sensible. And in a nutshell, the outcome was horrible death and destruction. I think the two most graphic numbers that highlight the death and destruction are in the Battle of Verdun over a few days in 1916, approximately 300,000 men die. At the Battle of the Somme, the British alone lose almost 60,000 men in 8 hours. And that's, basically 100 men for any one student at our school. And this goes on from the time in 8 hours. So that's when you walk into first period from the time you leave sports or club. I mean, that's how many human beings died in this war at that one time. And obviously, again, doing your last assignment, watching that documentary, seeing the footage from the war and hearing the interviews with the veterans, that's a far better way to actually learn about those horrific conditions, much better than I can ever do explaining it. So if you haven't watched that, please do. It's fascinating stuff. Again, this is really brief, but what were some of the critical long-term effects? Um, well, after this horrible death and bloodshed, the world says, this is going to be the war to end all wars. We cannot do this again. And there is a huge move towards global cooperation. So this idea of nationalism, this idea of imperialism, um, it people pull back from that for a while. And a group, organization called the League of Nations is made, where leaders from all countries around the world are supposed to be able to meet in one place to discuss problems as they come up rather than to avoid war, because we never want to fight another war. And this League of Nations is going to eventually evolve into the United Nations, which we still have. And they do things like they make rules about war, like the Geneva Convention. So if wars are ever fought again, they will be less cruel than this horrible thing called World War One. And that's why to this day there are international laws now about the use of poison gas in war. Um, so those are two things that come out of World War One. Another thing is the horrible death and destruction wreaked on that generation of young men and the people who were exposed to it, to everyone, resulted in what's often called the lost generation. And this meant that those young people who were fighting at that time, exposed to this war, lost faith in a lot of traditional institutions, traditional ideas about government, about education, about religion, about art, about music. why do all these things after experiencing the horrible nightmare we have just gone through? So this lost generation came to be known for going forging a new direction in their lives. They couldn't believe in what they had believed in before, so they kind of moved in a completely new direction. So this led to new art, to new music, to new poetry, a whole range of different things. So that was one other additional outcome of the First World War. And the fourth one I'm just going to mention briefly because we're going to talk about it when we talk about the rise of fascism in World War II in the next couple of weeks, is the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans, they lose the war. And when they lose the war, the Allied powers, the British, the French, the Russians, the Americans, they punish them severely. They make them give up land. They make them dismantle their military, both things that are hugely humiliating. And they force them to pay reparations or give money back to the Allies for as by saying we started the war, so we are paying you back for damages. And it forced those countries into huge depressions. So after World War One, Germany and Austria-Hungary and other countries are in this massive depression. The entire world goes into depression, but they are significantly suffering and they've been humiliated. And that situation creates an environment ripe for the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. And so we'll talk about that in our next lessons after we talk about the Russian Revolution. But that is another outcome of World War One that we want to keep in mind. So here's your assignment. I want you to think about, why do you think young people agree to go to war? Would you ever consider going to war? And if you did, for what reason? What reason to you would ever justify going and risking your own life and the life of others? In your answer, I want you to refer as much as possible to specific countries and the conditions involved in World War One. By this time, having watched the documentary and hopefully having listened to this video, you should know a little bit. And obviously, you can always go to the internet to learn more. And giving examples from that is going to allow you to learn more about this period in history. As always in your writing, you want to um, use accurate facts as much as possible, historical details in a well laid out structure, including your topic sentences and complete sentences, et cetera, and so forth. But more importantly, more important than anything else, I'm trying to get a sense of what you think. So that's assignment number 6. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Shoot me an email or a text. I'll be happy to answer it for you. I know this subject's a little grim and we're in somewhat challenging times. So I just want to emphasize again, thank you so much for sticking with it. It's a pleasure being your teacher. Can't wait till we're all back in the classroom. Look forward to talking to you again soon. Have a great day. Take care.